The morning mist clings to the windows of Rosie's diner like memories that refuse to fade. It's 6:30 in the morning, and the small-town establishment sits quietly on the corner of Main Street and Hope Avenue, a beacon of warm light in the gray Minnesota dawn. The neon sign flickers intermittently, casting pink and blue shadows on the wet pavement below. Inside, Margaret Helen Rose, 63 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, moves between tables with the quiet efficiency of someone who has served coffee and dreams for over 4 decades. Her uniform, a pale blue dress with white trim, has seen better days, but she wears it with dignity. There are stories in the lines around her eyes, songs in the way she hums softly while wiping down counters. The bell above the door chimes, and 3 businessmen in expensive suits enter, their voices loud and dismissive as they take a corner booth. They barely glance at Margaret as she approaches with menus and a pot of fresh coffee. "Just coffee," the first man says without looking up from his phone. "And make it quick. We've got a conference call in 10 minutes. Margaret nods politely, pouring their coffee with steady hands. "Would you gentlemen like to hear about our breakfast special? We said just coffee," the second man interrupts, waving her away like she's an annoying fly. "Can't you see we're busy here?" The third man snickers. "These small-town places, always trying to upsell you on yesterday's bacon." Margaret's cheeks flush slightly, but she maintains her composure. "Of course, let me know if you need anything else." As she turns away, one of the men makes a comment about washed-up waitresses that's meant to be overheard. Margaret's steps falter for just a moment, but she continues toward the kitchen, her head held high despite the sting of their words. The bell chimes again, and this time, a different kind of energy enters the diner. Bob Dylan, 79 years old, but carrying himself with the understated presence that has defined him for decades, steps inside. He's wearing a simple black coat and dark jeans, his graying hair slightly tousled by the morning wind. He's traveling alone, no entourage, no fanfare, just a man seeking shelter from the cold and perhaps something more. Dylan chooses a stool at the counter, his keen eyes taking in the authentic Americana that surrounds him, the vintage jukebox in the corner, the black and white photographs of the town's history, the handwritten menu board that speaks of simpler times. But most of all, he notices Margaret. There's something about the way she moves, a grace that speaks of inner strength, a quiet dignity that commands respect, even when others fail to give it. Dylan watches as she returns to the businessman's table, refilling their cups while they continue their loud conversation, completely ignoring her presence. "Excuse me, ma'am," Dylan says softly as Margaret passes behind the counter. She turns, and for the first time this morning, someone is looking at her, really looking at her, seeing her as a person rather than just a service provider. Her tired eyes brighten slightly. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" Dylan studies the menu board for a moment. "What would you recommend? You look like someone who knows this place better than anyone." Margaret is taken aback by the genuine interest in his voice. "Well, the apple pancakes are made from my grandmother's recipe. And the coffee, I grind the beans fresh every morning. Apple pancakes it is, and coffee." Dylan pauses, his voice gentle. "And please, take your time. I'm in no hurry." As Margaret moves to prepare his order, Dylan observes the diner more closely. This is authentic America, the kind of place where stories are born and dreams are either nurtured or quietly buried. He notices a small stage in the back corner, dusty and unused, with an old microphone stand and a forgotten guitar propped against the wall. "That stage back there," Dylan says when Margaret returns with his coffee. "Does anyone ever play anymore?" Margaret follows his gaze, her expression growing wistful. "Not for years now. Used to be Friday nights were music nights. Local folks would get up, share their songs, but people stopped coming, stopped listening. Now it just collects dust." There's something in her voice, a longing, perhaps even a secret sadness that catches Dylan's attention. "Did you ever get up there?" Margaret's hand trembles slightly as she sets down his coffee cup. Oh, heavens no, I'm just a waitress, always have been, always will be. But Dylan sees the lie in her eyes, the way her gaze lingers on that old guitar. Before he can pursue the conversation further, the businessmen at the corner table begin making a scene. "This coffee tastes like dishwater," the first man complains loudly, "and it's cold. Don't you people know how to do anything right in this god-forsaken town?" Margaret hurries over with a fresh pot, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry. Let me get you a fresh cup right away." "You should be sorry," the second man says. "We're important clients from Minneapolis, and this is the kind of service we get? No wonder this town is dying." Dylan watches the scene unfold, his jaw tightening. He's seen this kind of casual cruelty too many times, people using their perceived status to diminish others, to make themselves feel powerful by making someone else feel small. "And another thing," the third man adds. "We asked for our check 5 minutes ago. Some of us have real jobs to get to." Margaret's hands shake as she fumbles for her order pad. "Of course, I'll get that right away. I'm sorry for the delay." She hurries to the register, her composure finally beginning to crack. Dylan can see the tears forming in her eyes, the way her shoulders slump under the weight of their casual cruelty. In that moment, something stirs in him. The same instinct that has always driven his music, the need to give voice to the voiceless, to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Dylan says, rising from his stool and walking over to their table. His voice is calm but carries an unmistakable authority. The three men look up, annoyed by the interruption. "What do you want, old man?" Dylan stands quietly for a moment, his presence filling the space around him. There's something about him, a quiet intensity, an unspoken power that makes them uncomfortable. "I couldn't help but notice how you've been treating this lady," Dylan says, his voice steady and clear. "She's been nothing but polite and professional, and you've been treating her like she's beneath you." The first man scoffs. "Mind your own business, Grandpa. This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does," Dylan replies. "You see, I've spent my whole life meeting people, and I can tell you something about this woman that you're too blind to see. She's got more class in her little finger than the three of you have combined." The second man starts to stand, his face reddening. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Before Dylan can answer, Margaret appears at his side, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, it's all right. I don't want any trouble." Dylan turns to her, and in his eyes she sees something she hasn't seen in years. Respect, recognition, the acknowledgement of her worth as a human being. "Ma'am," Dylan says softly, "with your permission, I'd like to ask these gentlemen to reconsider their behavior." The businessmen are growing increasingly agitated, but there's something about Dylan's quiet confidence that gives them pause. He doesn't raise his voice, doesn't make threats. He simply stands there, unshakable in his conviction. "Look," the third man says, trying to regain control of the situation, "we don't know who you think you are, but we don't have time for this nonsense." Dylan reaches into his jacket and pulls out his wallet. He places a $50 bill on their table, more than enough to cover their coffee, and a generous tip. "Your breakfast is on me," he says, "but I think it's time you moved on." There's something in his tone that makes it clear this isn't a suggestion. The three men look at each other, uncertain now, the dynamic in the room having shifted completely. They've come face to face with a kind of quiet authority they don't understand and can't challenge. Grumbling and muttering under their breath, they gather their things and head for the door. As they leave, the first man throws back over his shoulder, "This town really is a dump." The door closes behind them, and suddenly the diner feels different. Lighter, more peaceful. Dylan returns to his stool at the counter, where his apple pancakes are waiting, now slightly cold. Margaret stands behind the counter, her hands trembling as she pours him fresh coffee. "You didn't have to do that," she says quietly. "Yes, I did," Dylan replies, cutting into his pancakes. "Some things you just can't let slide." They sit in comfortable silence for a moment, the morning sun beginning to stream through the windows, casting everything in a golden light. There's something happening between them, a recognition, a connection that goes deeper than the simple interaction they've shared. "I've never had anyone stand up for me like that," Margaret admits, her voice barely audible. Dylan looks up from his breakfast, studying her face. "That's a shame. Everyone deserves someone in their corner." Margaret wipes down the counter nervously, her eyes avoiding his. "You're not from around here." "No, I'm just passing through. But I know something about small towns, about people who work hard and don't ask for much in return." There's a pause, and then Margaret does something she hasn't done in years. She really looks at him, studying his face, trying to place something familiar in his features. "You look like someone I should know," she says quietly. Dylan smiles, not the practiced smile of a performer, but something genuine and warm. Maybe I just have one of those faces. As the morning progresses, more regular customers begin to filter into the diner. Harold Peterson, 75, a retired railroad worker, takes his usual spot at the end of the counter. Susan Martinez, 48, stops in for coffee before her shift at the hospital. Tommy Sullivan, 16, grabs a donut before school. Dylan watches Margaret interact with each of them, and he sees what the businessmen missed. She knows Harold takes his coffee black with exactly one sugar cube. She remembers that Susan's daughter just started college and asks how she's adjusting. She slips an extra donut into Tommy's bag because she knows his family is struggling. This isn't just a waitress serving customers. This is the heart of a community, someone who holds the stories and struggles of everyone who walks through that door. "Maggie!" Harold calls out, using the nickname that only the long-time customers employ. "Did you see they're tearing down the old Paramount Theatre?" Margaret's face falls. "No, I hadn't heard." "Shame," Harold continues, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "That place had real history. Remember when we used to have those music contests there? You were just a young thing then, but Lord, you could sing." Dylan's attention sharpens. He sees the color rise in Margaret's cheeks, the way she suddenly becomes very interested in wiping an already clean section of counter. "That was a long time ago, Harold." "Not that long," Harold insists. "You had the prettiest voice in the county." "Still do, I'd wager." Susan looks up from her newspaper. "Maggie used to write songs too. Beautiful ones. I still remember that one about the river, how it carried our dreams away." Dylan sets down his coffee cup carefully. The pieces of a puzzle are beginning to come together in his mind. "I don't write anymore," Margaret says quickly, her discomfort obvious. "That was just foolishness." "Wasn't foolish to me," Tommy chimes in. "My grandma used to talk about hearing you sing at the church socials, said you could make grown men cry." Margaret's eyes fill with tears, and she turns away to busy herself with unnecessary tasks. Dylan watches this exchange with growing fascination and something deeper. Recognition of a kindred spirit perhaps, someone else who has felt the pull of music in their soul. After the morning rush dies down, Dylan and Margaret find themselves alone again. The diner is quiet except for the soft hum of the coffee maker and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. "Those songs your friends mentioned," Dylan says carefully. "Do you still remember them?" Margaret freezes, a coffee pot suspended in her hand. I mean, it's been so long." "Music doesn't forget," Dylan says gently. "It stays with you, even when you try to put it away." Margaret sets down the coffee pot and looks at him directly for the first time. There's vulnerability in her eyes, but also a deep sadness that speaks of dreams deferred and chances not taken. "I used to write every day," she admits quietly, "had notebooks full of songs. But life gets in the way, you know. Bills to pay, people depending on you. Music doesn't put food on the table." Dylan nods, understanding. "What happened to the notebooks?" Margaret is quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in front of her. "They're upstairs, in a box in my bedroom. Haven't looked at them in 20 years. "Why?" The question hangs in the air between them. Margaret struggles with her answer, decades of buried emotion threatening to surface. "Because it hurts too much," she finally whispers. Because every time I look at those words, I remember who I used to be, who I thought I might become. And then I look at who I am now, and the disappointment is just... Dylan sees the pain in her eyes, recognizes it because he's seen it in mirrors and in the faces of countless musicians who never got their chance, who let life convince them their dreams were too small or too big or just not practical enough. "Can I tell you something?" Dylan asks, his voice gentle but serious. "Some of the most beautiful music I've ever heard came from people who thought they had nothing important to say, the ones who lived the songs instead of just singing them." Margaret looks at him with surprise. There's something in his words, in the way he speaks about music, that suggests he knows what he's talking about. "You talk like you know something about music yourself," she says. Dylan smiles, that enigmatic smile again. "A little. I've been around it most of my life." Before Margaret can ask more questions, the bell above the door chimes again. This time it's Father Michael Brennan, 70, the pastor of St. Mary's Catholic Church. He's a kind man with gentle eyes and the bearing of someone who has spent his life listening to other people's troubles. "Morning, Maggie," he says, taking a stool at the counter. "The usual, please." "Coming right up, Father," Margaret replies, the easy familiarity of their relationship evident in her tone. Father Brennan notices Dylan and nods politely. "Morning to you too, son. Just visiting our little town?" "Just passing through," Dylan replies, "but I'm glad I stopped. This seems like a special place." "It is," Father Brennan says warmly. "Small but full of good people. Maggie here is one of our treasures. Don't know what we'd do without her." Margaret blushes as she sets down the priest's coffee and a blueberry muffin. "Father, you're embarrassing me." "Just speaking the truth," Father Brennan insists. Then, turning to Dylan, he adds, "This woman has been taking care of this whole town for 40 years. Fed us, listened to our troubles, been there for every celebration and every funeral. If there's a heart to this place, it's Maggie Rose." Dylan nods thoughtfully. "She seems like someone with a lot of stories to tell." "Oh, she's got stories all right," Father Brennan says with a chuckle. "And songs too, though she's too modest to share them anymore." Margaret shoots the priest a warning look, but he continues anyway. "Used to be the finest songwriter in 3 counties. Had a voice like an angel and words that could touch your soul. I always told her she should have gone to Nashville, tried her luck." "Father, please," Margaret says, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Why didn't she?" Dylan asks, genuinely curious. Father Brennan's expression grows more serious. "Life, I suppose. Her parents got sick when she was young, needed caring for. Then she married that worthless husband of hers. God forgive me for speaking ill of the dead, but Tom Rose was a man who never saw the treasure he had. Drank too much, gambled away what little they had. Maggie kept this family afloat through sheer determination." Dylan glances at Margaret, who has turned away to hide her emotional reaction to the priest's words. "She raised 2 children mostly on her own," Father Brennan continues. "Both of them turned out fine, thanks to her. But her dreams, well, dreams have a way of getting pushed aside when life gets hard. Where are her children now?" Dylan asks. "Sarah's a nurse in Seattle doing wonderful work. Michael's a teacher in Chicago. They've got good lives, good families. Maggie sees them maybe twice a year if she's lucky." The picture is becoming clearer to Dylan, a woman who sacrificed everything for others, who put her dreams on hold until one day she forgot she ever had them. "Father," Margaret says finally, her voice tight with emotion, "I think our guest has heard enough of my ancient history." Father Brennan realizes he's said too much and pats Margaret's hand gently. "Sorry, my dear. Sometimes an old priest talks too much for his own good." Dylan finishes his pancakes and sits quietly for a moment, processing everything he's learned. There's something about Margaret's story that resonates with him, that speaks to the part of him that has always been drawn to the authentic voices, the ones that have something real to say. "Maggie," he says finally, "would you mind if I asked you something?" She turns to face him, her guard still up but curiosity winning out. "What's that?" "If you could go back, knowing what you know now, would you do it differently?" The question catches her off guard. She stares at him for a long moment, searching his face for clues about why he's asking. What do you mean? The music, the songs. If you had a chance to share them with the world, would you take it? Margaret's laugh is bitter. At my age, who would want to hear songs from an old waitress? Anyone who believes that wisdom comes with experience, Dylan replies. Anyone who understands that the best stories come from people who have lived them. There's something in his tone that makes both Margaret and Father Brennan look at him more carefully. There's an authority there, a conviction that suggests he's not just making polite conversation. Are you in the music business? Father Brennan asks directly. Dylan considers his answer for a moment. You could say that. I've been around musicians my whole life. Before they can pursue the question further, the lunch crowd begins to arrive. Margaret returns to work, moving between tables with practiced efficiency, but Dylan notices that something has changed in her demeanor. She's more thoughtful, more aware of herself and her movements. Dylan orders a simple sandwich and continues to observe the rhythm of the diner. He watches Margaret interact with her customers, seeing how naturally she connects with people, how easily they open up to her. There's something almost musical in the way she moves through the space, a natural rhythm that speaks of someone who understands the flow of human emotion. Around 2 o'clock, the lunch crowd thins out, and Margaret approaches Dylan's table with a fresh cup of coffee. You've been here most of the day, she observes. Don't you have somewhere to be? Not really, Dylan admits. I'm between commitments right now. Sometimes it's nice to just exist for a while. Margaret nods understanding. I know what you mean, though I can't remember the last time I had that luxury. When do you get off work? The question surprises her. Why do you ask? Because I'd like to hear one of those songs your friends keep talking about. Margaret's face flushes. Oh, I couldn't. I mean, I don't even remember them properly. I bet you do, Dylan says gently. Music lives in the muscle memory. Once it's in your bones, it never really leaves. Margaret glances around the diner, making sure no one is listening. I don't even play guitar anymore. Haven't touched one in years. Dylan nods toward the dusty instrument in the corner. What about that one? That old thing? It probably doesn't even stay in tune. Want to find out? There's a challenge in his voice, but also an invitation. Margaret looks at him, then at the guitar, then back at him. For a moment, she seems to be having an internal struggle, decades of self-doubt, warring with something deeper, a longing that never fully died. I close at 4, she says finally. If you're still here, then maybe we could see if that old guitar still has any music left in it. Dylan smiles. I'll be here. The afternoon passes slowly. Dylan moves to a table near the window, pulling out a small notebook and occasionally jotting down thoughts. Margaret goes about her work, but there's an energy about her that wasn't there before, an anticipation that makes her movements more purposeful. At exactly 4 o'clock, Margaret flips the sign on the door to closed and locks the deadbolt. The diner falls into the quiet that comes at the end of a day, dust motes dancing in the late afternoon sunlight that streams through the windows. Well, she says, suddenly nervous, I suppose you want to hear about those songs. Dylan stands and walks over to the corner where the guitar sits neglected. He picks it up carefully, running his fingers over the worn wood and testing the strings. Surprisingly, it's not too far out of tune. This is a nice instrument, he says, making small adjustments to the tuning pegs. Martin D28, good guitar for songwriting. Margaret watches him with growing surprise. His hands move over the instrument with obvious familiarity, and the casual way he identified the guitar's make and model suggests he knows more about music than he's been letting on. You play, she states rather than asks. A little, Dylan admits, strumming a few chords to check the tuning. The sound fills the diner with warmth. Why don't you sit down and we'll see what this old girl can do? Margaret sits at a nearby table, her hands folded nervously in her lap. Dylan pulls up a chair facing her and begins to play softly, nothing fancy, just gentle finger-picking that creates a peaceful atmosphere. "This reminds me of the old days," Margaret says quietly, "when this place was full of music." "Tell me about that," Dylan says, continuing to play. Margaret's eyes grow distant. "Every Friday night, for about 10 years, we'd push back some tables and have what we called songbird nights. Local folks would get up and share their music. Farmers who wrote ballads about the changing seasons. High school kids working through their first heartbreaks. Senior citizens singing the songs their grandparents taught them. And you?" I was usually too nervous to get up there. But sometimes late in the evening, when everyone was relaxed and the lights were low, I'd share something I'd written." Dylan nods encouragingly. "What kind of songs did you write?" Margaret is quiet for a moment, listening to the gentle music flowing from the guitar. "Stories, mostly, about the people who came through here. The traveling salesman who was trying to get home to see his daughter graduate. The young woman who stopped here every month on her way to visit her son in prison. The old man who told me about losing his farm, but still found reasons to smile." As she speaks, Dylan's playing subtly shifts, complementing her words with chord progressions that seem to draw the stories out of her. "There was one song," Margaret continues, her voice growing stronger, "about a woman who spent her whole life taking care of others and forgot to take care of her dreams. I called it the Waiting Song. Do you remember how it went?" Margaret closes her eyes, and for a moment she seems to be reaching back through decades of buried memory. Then very softly she begins to sing. She pours the coffee, wipes the tears, holds the stories of the years. Every stranger finds a friend in this place where journeys end. But who will hold her when she falls? Who will hear her when she calls? In the waiting, in the giving, has she forgotten how to live? Her voice, though rusty from disuse, carries a quality that makes Dylan stop playing and listen. There's something raw and authentic about it, a lived-in quality that can't be taught or manufactured. "Margaret," Dylan says softly when she finishes, "that's beautiful." She opens her eyes, surprised by the emotion in his voice. "It's just an old song." "No," Dylan says firmly. "It's not just anything. That's real. That's the kind of song that matters." Margaret looks at him with confusion. "What do you mean?" Dylan sets the guitar aside and leans forward. "I mean that what you just sang came from a place of truth. And truth is the hardest thing to find in music these days." There's something in his tone that makes Margaret pay closer attention. "You really do know about music, don't you?" Dylan is quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. "I've spent my life around songs and the people who write them. And I can tell you, without any doubt, that what you just shared has more honesty and power than most of what you hear on the radio." Margaret shakes her head. "You're just being kind." "No, I'm not." Dylan's voice carries absolute conviction. "Margaret, how many songs did you write?" I don't know. Dozens, maybe. I kept them all in notebooks." "And you never tried to do anything with them?" Margaret's defensive walls go up again. "Do what with them? I'm a waitress in a small town. I don't know anything about the music business." "The music business isn't about what you know," Dylan says. "It's about what you feel, what you have to say. And you, Margaret Rose, have something to say." There's a long silence between them. Margaret stares at her hands, decades of doubt and disappointment warring with something she thought she'd buried forever. "Hope. Would you," Dylan says carefully, "would you sing another one?" Margaret looks up at him, and for the first time she really sees him. Not just a kind stranger who stood up for her, but someone who understands music in a way that few people do. "Who are you?" she asks quietly. Dylan meets her gaze directly. "I'm someone who recognizes talent when he hears it. Someone who believes that good songs deserve to be heard." Margaret stands and walks to the window, looking out at the small town that has been her whole world. "There was another song," she says finally, "about a river that runs through town. It's about how water keeps flowing, even when everything else stands still. I'd like to hear it." Margaret turns back to him, and something has shifted in her expression. The self-doubt is still there, but it's being challenged by something stronger. The part of her that never really died, the songwriter who has been waiting patiently for someone to listen. "If I sing it," she says, "will you tell me the truth about what you think?" "I promise." Margaret returns to her chair and closes her eyes again. Dylan picks up the guitar and begins to play, letting her voice guide him to the right chords. When she begins to sing, her voice is stronger this time, more confident. There's a river running through this town, carrying dreams both up and down. Some folks stand and watch it flow, others jump and let it go. I've been standing on the shore, watching life float by my door, but the water keeps on calling. Says it's never too late for falling. In. The song continues for several verses, painting pictures of life in a small town, of dreams deferred and hopes that refuse to die. Dylan finds himself genuinely moved by her lyrics, by the way she captures universal truths in simple, honest language. When she finishes, the diner falls into complete silence. Margaret opens her eyes and looks at Dylan anxiously. "Well?" Dylan sets the guitar down carefully and looks at her with an expression she can't read. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." "Okay. If someone wanted to help you share these songs with the world, would you let them?" Margaret's laugh is shaky. "What do you mean, share them with the world? Who would want to help an old waitress from Minnesota?" Dylan stands and walks over to her. "Someone who has spent his life in music. Someone who knows the difference between manufactured emotion and the real thing. Someone who understands that the best songs come from people who have lived them." "I don't understand." Dylan reaches into his jacket and pulls out his wallet. From it, he takes a business card and hands it to Margaret. Margaret looks at the card and her face goes white. The simple black text reads, "Bob Dylan, Columbia Records." She looks up at him, her mouth open in shock. I'm someone who has been looking his whole life for voices like yours. Real voices, honest voices, voices that have something to say because they've lived something worth saying." Margaret stares at the card, then at Dylan, then back at the card. "Bob Dylan," she whispers. "You're Bob Dylan." Dylan nods. "And you, Margaret Rose, are exactly the kind of songwriter the world needs more of." Margaret's hands are shaking now. This is impossible. People like me don't." "People like you are exactly who do." Dylan interrupts gently. "Margaret, I've heard thousands of songs in my life. I've worked with the biggest names in the business. And what you just shared with me has more heart and truth than most of them." Margaret stands abruptly and begins pacing around the diner. "This is crazy. This morning I was just a waitress serving coffee, and now you're telling me—" "I'm telling you that talent doesn't care about your job title or your age or how long you've been waiting. Good songs are good songs, and you've got them." Margaret stops pacing and looks at him directly. "What are you saying exactly?" Dylan takes a deep breath. "I'm saying that if you're willing, I'd like to help you make a record. A real record, with your songs, your voice, your stories." The words hang in the air between them like a bridge spanning 40 years of deferred dreams. "A record," Margaret repeats quietly. "These songs deserve to be heard, Margaret. They deserve to find the people who need to hear them." Margaret sinks back into her chair, overwhelmed. "I'm 63 years old. So was Johnny Cash when he made some of his best music. I don't know anything about recording studios or—" "You don't need to. You just need to bring the songs." Margaret looks around the diner, at the worn counters she's wiped down thousands of times, at the tables where she served countless meals and listened to countless stories, at the stage where she once dared to dream. "Why?" she asks finally. "Why would you do this for me?" Dylan sits back down and picks up the guitar again, playing softly. "Because 40 years ago, someone took a chance on a young man from Minnesota who had something to say, but no idea how to say it professionally. Because good music is rare, and when you find it, you have an obligation to help it reach the people who need it." He pauses, looking at her with complete sincerity. "And because that song about waiting, that's not just your story, Margaret. That's the story of a lot of people who have been told they're not important enough, not young enough, not commercial enough. Your voice could speak for all of them." Margaret is crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm scared. Good, Dylan says. The best music comes from being scared, from being vulnerable enough to tell the truth. They sit in silence for several minutes, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the diner floor. Finally, Margaret wipes her eyes and looks at Dylan with something approaching determination. Those notebooks upstairs, she says. There are 5 of them, full of songs I wrote over 20 years. I'd like to see them if you're willing to share them. Margaret nods slowly. Okay, but I have one condition. What's that? If we do this, if we really do this, I want it to be honest. I don't want to pretend to be something I'm not. I'm a waitress from a small town who has seen a lot of life and has some thoughts about it. That's all I am, and that's all I want to be. Dylan smiles, the first completely unguarded smile Margaret has seen from him. Margaret, that's exactly what the world needs. No pretense, no manufactured image. Just you, your songs, and your truth. Margaret stands and smooths down her uniform dress. I'll go get those notebooks. As she heads for the stairs that lead to her small apartment above the diner, Dylan calls after her. Margaret, she turns back. Thank you. For what? For reminding me why I fell in love with music in the first place? Margaret disappears upstairs, and Dylan is left alone in the diner with his thoughts. He looks around at this authentic piece of America, this place where real life happens every day, where stories are born and shared, and sometimes, if you're lucky, turned into songs that matter. 20 minutes later, Margaret returns carrying 5 worn composition notebooks. She sets them on the table in front of Dylan with the reverence of someone handling sacred artifacts. These are them, she says quietly. 23 years of songs. Dylan opens the first notebook carefully. The pages are filled with handwritten lyrics in Margaret's careful script, some crossed out and rewritten, others accompanied by chord notations and small notes about melody. He reads silently for several minutes, his expression growing more amazed with each page. Margaret, he says, finally looking up at her, these are extraordinary. She's sitting across from him, nervously twisting a dish towel in her hands. You really think so? Dylan continues reading, occasionally humming melodies that seem to naturally fit the words. This one here, Highway Confessions. It's about a trucker who stops here regularly? Big Jim Morrison. Not the singer, Margaret says with a small smile. He drives coast to coast, stops here every other Tuesday, lost his wife 2 years ago and doesn't know how to go home to an empty house, so he just keeps driving. Dylan nods, understanding. And this one? Sunday Shoes? Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, 92 years old, walks to church every Sunday in the same pair of patent leather shoes she wore to her wedding in 1951. She told me once that those shoes have walked through 70 years of joys and sorrows, and they still carry her to hope every week. As Dylan continues through the notebooks, a picture emerges of a woman who has been quietly documenting the American experience through the lives of ordinary people. Every song is rooted in truth, in actual human experience, in the kind of authentic emotion that can't be manufactured. This is incredible work, Margaret. You've been creating a musical documentary of American life without even realizing it. Margaret blushes. I just wrote about what I saw, what moved me. That's what the best songwriters do. Dylan closes the notebook and looks at her seriously. I want to ask you something, and I need you to really think about your answer. Okay. Are you ready to change your life? The question hangs heavy in the air. Margaret stares at him, understanding that this moment is a crossroads, that her answer will determine not just her future, but who she becomes in whatever years she has left. What would that mean exactly? It means recording these songs professionally. It means putting together a band of musicians who can do justice to your words. It means, eventually, sharing them with the world through concerts and radio and streaming services. It means stepping out of this diner and onto stages where people will listen to your stories. Margaret's face goes pale. Stages? You mean perform? That's usually how music reaches people, Dylan says gently. but we'd take it slow. Start with a recording, see how people respond. If there's interest, maybe some small venues. Nothing you're not ready for. Margaret stands and walks to the window again, looking out at the town she's never left, the life she's always known. I've never even been on an airplane. We can work with that. The first step is just making the record. Everything else can happen at your pace, or not at all. Margaret turns back to him. And you would really do this? Help me, I mean? Why would someone like you spend time on someone like me? Dylan stands and joins her at the window. Margaret, can I tell you something about the music business? It's full of people who can sing pretty or play fast or look good on camera, but it's very short on people who have something real to say. Your songs? They have something to say. He pauses, choosing his words carefully. There's a whole generation of people out there who feel invisible, who feel like their stories don't matter because they're not young or glamorous or trending on social media. Your voice could speak for them. Your songs could remind them that their lives have value, that their experiences matter. Margaret wipes her eyes with the dish towel. You really believe that? I know it. I've been doing this for 60 years, Margaret. I've seen what happens when authentic music meets people who need to hear it. It changes lives. The sun is beginning to set outside, casting the diner in warm golden light. Margaret looks around at the familiar space one more time, as if seeing it for the first time. If I said yes, she says quietly, what would happen next? Next week I have some studio time booked in Nashville. Nothing fancy, just a place where we can record a few of your songs acoustically, just you and a guitar. We'll see how they sound, how they feel. If you like what we get, we'll talk about next steps. Nashville, Margaret repeats, the word carrying the weight of every country music dream ever dreamed. It's just a city with some good recording studios, Dylan says. The magic isn't in the place, it's in the songs. Margaret is quiet for a long time, thinking. Finally, she speaks. There's one more song I need to tell you about. I've never written it down, never sung it for anyone. It's been living in my head for 30 years. What's it about? It's about a moment when everything changes, when you realize that the life you've been living isn't the only life you could live, when possibility opens up like a door you didn't know was there. Dylan nods. What do you call it? The door I didn't know was there. Dylan picks up the guitar and begins playing softly. Would you sing it for me? Margaret takes a deep breath, and for the third time that day, she lets her voice fill the diner. But this time is different. This time she's not just remembering a song, she's living it. I thought I knew the shape of my days. Coffee and smiles and familiar ways. Serving the dreams of folks passing through. Never imagining dreams could be true. Then someone saw what I couldn't see. Said there's a song living inside of me. Now I'm standing here, scared but alive, at the door I didn't know was there to find. Her voice grows stronger with each verse, and Dylan realizes he's witnessing something special, not just a good song, but a moment of transformation, a woman rediscovering who she was, always meant to be. When she finishes, they sit in complete silence for several minutes. The diner around them seems to hold its breath, as if the building itself understands that something significant has just happened within its walls. Margaret, Dylan says finally, that's not just a song, that's a statement of purpose. She looks at him with tears in her eyes. Is it crazy? Am I crazy to even think about this at my age? The only crazy thing would be not thinking about it. Dylan closes the notebook and looks at her with complete seriousness. Margaret Rose, you have a gift. You have something the world needs to hear. The question is, are you brave enough to let them hear it? Margaret stands and walks over to the old stage in the corner. She touches the microphone stand gently, as if greeting an old friend she hasn't seen in years. I used to dream about this, she says quietly. When I was young, I used to imagine singing my songs for people who needed to hear them. But then life got complicated, and dreams seemed frivolous. Dreams are never frivolous, Dylan says. They're the things that keep us human. Margaret turns back to him, and there's something different in her posture, in the way she carries herself. The frightened, apologetic waitress is being replaced by someone stronger, more purposeful. "If I do this," she says, "I want to do it right. I want these songs to be the best they can be." "They already are," Dylan assures her. "They're honest. They're real. They come from experience. That's what makes them good. But I've never worked with real musicians, never been in a proper studio." "We'll take care of all that. I know musicians who would be honored to work with songs like these, people who understand that the music serves the story, not the other way around." Margaret walks back to the table and looks down at her notebooks. "These have been my secret for so long. It feels strange to think of sharing them." "The best secrets are the ones that eventually get told," Dylan says, "usually to the people who need to hear them most." Margaret sits back down and opens one of the notebooks to a page near the back. "There's one more thing I should tell you about. This song here, The Invisible Army, it's about people like me. People who work the jobs nobody notices, who keep the world running while staying invisible themselves." Dylan reads the lyrics silently, his expression growing more amazed. Margaret, this is powerful stuff. This is the kind of song that can change how people see the world." "You think so?" "I know so. This is protest music, Margaret. The best kind, the kind that protests invisibility, that insists on the dignity of ordinary people." Margaret looks surprised. "I never thought of it that way. I just wanted to say something about all the people I've met over the years who work so hard and get so little recognition." That's exactly what protest music should do. It should give voice to the voiceless. They spend the next hour going through more of Margaret's songs. Dylan is consistently amazed by the depth and authenticity of her work. Here is a writer who has been quietly documenting American life from a perspective rarely heard, that of the working-class woman who has seen it all and understands it all, but has never been asked what she thinks about any of it. "Margaret," Dylan says as the last light fades from the windows, "I want to make you a promise. If you're willing to trust me with these songs, I'll make sure they're treated with the respect they deserve. This won't be some novelty act or feel-good story about the singing waitress. This will be serious music by a serious artist." "But I'm not an artist," Margaret protests. "You're a songwriter who has been documenting the American experience for 23 years, Dylan interrupts firmly. "You're an artist who has chosen ordinary life as your canvas. Don't diminish what you've accomplished." Margaret is quiet for a moment, absorbing his words. "It's hard to think of myself that way." "Then let me think of you that way, until you can do it yourself." Outside, the streetlights are coming on, casting pools of warm light on the empty sidewalks. The diner feels like a sanctuary, a place where time has stopped to allow for this impossible conversation. "I need to ask you something," Margaret says. "Why me? You could work with anyone. Young singers with pretty voices, established artists with proven track records. Why would you want to work with a 63-year-old waitress?" Dylan considers his answer carefully. "Because in 60 years of making music, I've learned that the best songs come from people who have something to say, not from people who sound good saying nothing. You have something to say, Margaret. You have things to say that nobody else can say because nobody else has lived your life." He pauses, looking around the diner. "And because this country is full of people like you, people who work hard, care deeply, and have been told their whole lives that their thoughts and feelings don't matter. When they hear your voice singing your words, they'll recognize themselves. They'll feel seen." Margaret nods slowly. "That's what I always hoped when I was writing, that maybe someday someone would hear these songs and feel less alone. That's going to happen, Margaret. I promise you that." Margaret stands and begins turning off the lights in the diner one by one. As the space grows dimmer, it feels even more intimate, more like a confessional or a sacred space. "There's something else I need to tell you," she says as she locks the register. "I'm scared. Terrified, actually. I've spent my whole life in this little town, taking care of other people. I don't know how to be someone who asks for attention, who puts herself forward. You don't have to be someone different, Dylan assures her. You just have to be who you've always been, but in front of a microphone instead of behind a counter. What if I'm not good enough? What if people don't connect with the songs? Dylan stands and helps her stack the notebooks. Margaret, let me tell you something. I've heard you sing 3 songs today, and every one of them has moved me, and I've heard a lot of songs. He looks at her seriously. The world is full of technically perfect singers who have nothing to say. What it needs is people with something to say who are willing to say it imperfectly. Your songs are perfect not because they're polished, but because they're true. Margaret turns off the last light, leaving only the glow from the streetlights outside. If I do this, everything changes, doesn't it? Everything changes anyway, Dylan replies. Time keeps moving whether we take chances or not. The question is, do you want to spend your remaining years wondering what might have been, or do you want to find out what could be? Margaret locks the door behind them as they step out into the cool evening air. The town is quiet, most people already home with their families, settling in for another ordinary evening in their ordinary lives. I'll need some time to think about this, Margaret says. Dylan nods. Of course. This is a big decision. How long do I have? As long as you need. But Margaret? Dylan pauses. Don't let fear make the decision for you. Fear is a terrible advisor when it comes to dreams. They stand on the sidewalk in front of the diner, 2 people whose lives have been forever changed by a single day. Margaret clutches her notebooks to her chest like a shield. How will I reach you? She asks. When I decide. Dylan hands her another business card, this one with a phone number written on the back. Call me, day or night. Margaret looks at the card, then at Dylan, then at the diner where she has spent 40 years of her life. Can I ask you one more thing? Anything. Do you really think I have something worth sharing? Not just being kind, but really. Dylan looks at her for a long moment, and when he speaks, his voice carries the weight of absolute conviction. Margaret rose. I have spent my entire career looking for authentic voices, for people who have lived their songs before they wrote them. What you have is rarer than talent, rarer than technical skill. You have truth, and truth, when it's set to music and sung with conviction, has the power to change the world. Margaret's eyes fill with tears. Thank you for seeing me, for listening, for making me remember who I used to dream of being. You're not remembering who you used to dream of being, Dylan says gently. You're discovering who you've always been. The songwriter was always there, Margaret. She was just waiting for someone to listen. Dylan begins walking toward his hotel, but turns back after a few steps. Margaret, when you're thinking about this decision, don't think about the business side or the logistics or any of that. Just think about the songs. Think about the people who need to hear them. Think about the truths you have to tell. Let the songs decide. Margaret watches him disappear into the evening shadows, then looks down at the notebooks in her arms. For the first time in decades, they don't feel like relics of a foolish past. They feel like possibilities. 3 days pass. Margaret goes through the motions of her regular routine, opening the diner at 6, serving coffee and conversation, cleaning tables and listening to stories. But something has changed. She finds herself really hearing the stories her customers tell, seeing them not just as pleasant conversation, but as potential songs. Harold Peterson talks about his grandson, who's struggling with addiction, and Margaret hears a song about hope in the darkness. Susan Martinez mentions how tired she is from working double shifts, and Margaret hears a song about the hidden heroes who keep the world running. Tommy Sullivan talks about his dreams of leaving town someday, and Margaret hears a song about small-town kids with big city dreams. On the 3rd evening, after closing the diner, Margaret sits at the counter with a cup of tea and opens one of her notebooks. She begins reading her own words, as if seeing them for the first time, trying to imagine them not as private thoughts, but as messages meant to be shared. She stops at a song called Letters to My Younger Self and reads it aloud to the empty diner. If I could write a letter to the girl I used to be, I'd tell her not to wait so long to set her spirit free. I'd tell her that the dreams she hides are worth the risk of shame, that playing it safe is just another way to play a losing game. But maybe that young girl couldn't hear what she wasn't ready to know. Maybe some wisdom only comes to hearts that have learned to let go. Her voice echoes in the empty space, and for the first time she hears her songs not as amateur attempts but as completed thoughts, as messages that someone else might need to receive. She walks over to the old guitar in the corner and picks it up. It stays in tune better now, thanks to Dylan's adjustments. She plays through several of her songs, and with each one, her confidence grows. That night, Margaret climbs the stairs to her small apartment and sits at her kitchen table with Dylan's business card. She stares at the phone number for a long time before finally dialing. The phone rings 3 times before Dylan's familiar voice answers. "Hello? Mr. Dylan? This is Margaret Rose. Margaret, I've been hoping you'd call. I've been thinking about what you said, about the songs deciding. And?" Margaret takes a deep breath. They want to be heard. There's a pause on the other end of the line, and when Dylan speaks, she can hear the smile in his voice. "Then let's make sure they get heard. Are you ready to go to Nashville?" "I'm terrified, but yes." "Good. Terror means you care about the outcome. When can you leave?" Margaret looks around her tiny apartment at the life she's built from routine and responsibility. "I'll need to arrange coverage for the diner. Maybe a week?" "Perfect. I'll make the arrangements and call you with the details." "Mr. Dylan? Call me Bob. Bob, thank you for everything. Thank me after we've made the record. That's when the real work begins." After she hangs up, Margaret sits in her kitchen for a long time, looking out the window at the sleeping town below. Tomorrow, she'll begin the process of stepping out of the life she's always known and into something completely unknown. For the first time in 40 years, she's not afraid of the unknown. She's excited by it. 1 week later, Margaret Rose boards her first airplane, carrying a small suitcase and 5 worn notebooks filled with 40 years of dreams. As the plane lifts off from Minneapolis, she looks down at the patchwork of farms and small towns that have been her whole world. "I'm coming back," she whispers to the window, "but I won't be the same person when I do." The recording session in Nashville is unlike anything Margaret could have imagined. The studio is smaller than she expected, more intimate than intimidating. Dylan has assembled a small group of musicians, a bass player, a drummer, a pedal steel guitarist, all of whom treat her songs with the reverence usually reserved for established classics. "These are beautiful songs, ma'am," the bass player tells her during a break. "They remind me why I fell in love with music in the first place." They spend 3 days recording 12 of Margaret's songs. Dylan produces with a light touch, focusing on capturing the authenticity of her voice and the honesty of her lyrics, rather than creating polished perfection. On the final day, as Margaret listens to the playback of The Waiting Song, she begins to cry. "What's wrong?" Dylan asks. "Nothing's wrong," Margaret says, wiping her eyes. "It's just, that's my voice, that's my song, and it sounds real." "It is real," Dylan assures her. "That's what makes it good." The album, titled Letters from the Counter, is released 6 months later on Dylan's own record label. The initial pressing is small, just a few thousand copies, but something magical happens. The people who hear it tell other people about it. Radio DJs who receive advance copies start playing the songs. Music bloggers begin writing about the authentic voice of Margaret Rose. Margaret's first concert is at a small venue in Minneapolis, just 40 miles from her hometown. She's terrified as she walks onto the stage, but when she sees the faces in the audience, people of all ages, but especially those her own age, she understands what Dylan meant about finding the people who need to hear these songs. She opens with The Waiting Song, and by the chorus, half the audience is singing along, having learned it from the radio. When she finishes, the applause is thunderous, but more importantly, it's genuine. These people aren't just applauding a performance, they're applauding recognition, the joy of hearing their own lives reflected in song. "This next song," Margaret says into the microphone, is about all the people who keep the world running while staying invisible. It's called The Invisible Army. As she sings, Margaret sees a woman in the front row crying. After the show, the woman approaches her. "I'm a school custodian," the woman says. 42 years cleaning up after other people. Nobody ever wrote a song about me before. Thank you." That's when Margaret truly understands what Dylan meant about music changing the world. It doesn't change the world through grand gestures or revolutionary messages. It changes the world one person at a time by helping them feel seen, understood, valued. Over the next 2 years, Margaret performs regularly, always returning to Millfield between tours to work at the diner. She insists on keeping her day job, not because she needs the money anymore, but because it keeps her connected to the source of her songs, real people living real lives. Letters from the Counter wins a Grammy for Best Folk Album. At the ceremony, Margaret, now 65 and still wearing her modest dress and sensible shoes, gives a speech that moves the audience to tears. "I want to thank everyone who believed that an old waitress might have something worth saying," she begins. "But mostly, I want to thank all the invisible people who trusted me with their stories. Every song on this album comes from someone I met behind a counter, someone who thought nobody was listening. This Grammy belongs to all of them." The camera finds Dylan in the audience, and he's smiling with the pride of someone who discovered a treasure and shared it with the world. In the months that follow, Margaret continues to write, to perform, and to work at the diner. She's found a balance between her two lives, the famous folk singer and the small-town waitress, and she's happier than she's ever been. One morning, a young woman enters the diner carrying a guitar case. She's nervous, shy, and orders just coffee. Margaret recognizes something familiar in her eyes. "You're a musician," Margaret says, not asking. The young woman nods. "I write songs, but they're probably not very good." Margaret pours the woman's coffee and sits down across from her. "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Kim." "Well, Sarah, let me tell you something about songs. The good ones aren't about being good. They're about being true. Do your songs tell the truth?" Sarah considers this. "I think so. They're about being young and broke and scared and hopeful all at the same time." Margaret smiles. "Those sound like songs the world needs to hear. Would you play one for me?" As Sarah opens her guitar case, Margaret catches a glimpse of herself 40 years ago, a woman with stories to tell, but afraid to tell them, waiting for someone to listen, to believe, to say that her voice matters. "You know," Margaret says, as Sarah tunes her guitar, "I know someone who might like to hear your songs." The circle continues. Dreams deferred become dreams fulfilled, which become dreams inspired in others. The invisible become visible, the voiceless find their voice, and the world becomes a little richer for their stories. In the end, Margaret Rose learned that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be. Sometimes it just takes someone seeing you clearly enough to show you your own reflection. As Bob Dylan once sang, "The answer is blowing in the wind." But sometimes the answer is sitting behind a counter, serving coffee and collecting stories, waiting for someone to notice that the waitress has something to say. Sometimes the person who seems the most ordinary has been extraordinary all along. They just needed someone to listen long enough to hear it. Sometimes a stranger walking into a diner can change everything, and sometimes letting someone truly see you is the bravest thing you can do. Margaret Rose kept serving coffee and writing songs until she was 83 years old. She recorded 5 albums, won 3 Grammys, and inspired countless other ordinary people to share their extraordinary stories with the world. But she never forgot that it all began with a simple act of kindness, one person standing up for another in a moment when it mattered most. And every morning, as she opened the diner and prepared the coffee, she remembered Bob Dylan's words, "Never underestimate a kind heart. The person you help may change your life." In Margaret's case, the person who helped her change not just her life, but the lives of everyone who heard her songs and realized that their own voice might matter too. That's the power of believing in someone. That's the magic of seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary. That's what happens when kindness meets courage and dreams get the chance they've been waiting for. If you've been moved by Margaret's story, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments about a time when someone believed in you or when you believed in someone else. Because everyone has a song to sing, sometimes they just need someone to listen. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to say, "I'd like to hear that song."